So the natural history of Essex has been dramatically shaped by its relationship to the Connecticut River. Our town's waterfront and river systems, including the Falls River, are an economic and tourism driver. They are directly linked to the history of the town and provide much of the sense of place that's so prized by our residents and our visitors alike. And additionally, these natural systems are an important part of the town's capacity for resilience during extreme weather events. And these natural systems, notably Essex Harbor and Thatchbed Island, are experiencing challenges and undergoing changes that could potentially impact the accessibility of our waterfront. And as Jeff will share with us, if we don't address these issues, we could see increased storm damage to South and Middle Coves, a reduction in the amount of anchorages that we have available, and possibly a significant reduction in the size of Thatchbed Island itself. So with that as an opening, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. And Jeff, just let me know when you want me to change the slides. Thank you.
Okay, afternoon. Let's start with covering the basic situation of Essex and the Connecticut River. The Connecticut River is the longest river in New England, runs from the Canadian border to Long Island Sound. It's naturally navigable north to just beyond Hartford. Essex is the first natural harbor heading upriver from Long Island Sound. And that was extremely important in the first settling and the development of the village area in Essex. From the earliest arrival of Europeans to the area, Essex became a harbor and a port for travelers using the river. In the early years, about 300 years ago, it emerged into a home port to captains, sailors, eventually boat builders, service facilities, including home of the first United States warship, the Oliver Cromwell. And of course, it became a target of the British in April of 1814. When the age of steamship travel began, Essex was the first stop in the river for steamship traveling from New York to Middletown, Hartford, and so forth. It became a really important connection for commercial travel. It had a deep natural river channel that swept past the village. Just south of the anchorage area, there's a day marker that marks a reef. And the natural channel came from there and swung in towards what is now Essex Yacht Club and swept along the face of the peninsula. Naturally, the steamboat dock was a primary spot for the steamships. And then from there, it heads up to Brockway and further upriver, of course. At some point or another of 50s and 60s, tugs pushing barges and small freighters began increasingly to use the river to move coal, oil, and other materials. And so it became important from a commercial standpoint that the channel be worked to improve the ease of use. So the Army Corps of Engineers revamped the river channel. They changed the natural river channel that swept in front of the village and dug out Essex Shoal in the middle of the river and dredged a channel to 15 feet deep at low tide, and did similar actions in the Deep River area and further upriver all the way to including in Hartford. So they were trying to improve it to make it easier for tugs, barges, and so forth to use it. The area now occupied by Essex Yacht Club was Phil. In the early days, that whole area was just an open section to Middle Cove. And in the years since, there was a tank farm there for a while. And so they filled and bulkheaded and dredged for access. And then it got used and used differently. And each time, and until it's gotten to where it is now at Essex Yacht Club, There's a large spot you can see in this slide, the white area there, that's all filled in. So back in the days when they were building what were then called ships in the inner part of Middle Cove, that was entirely open, and it was a deeper area from Middle Cove. So if we move up to the 1950s, Thatchbed was about 25 or so acres, and it's a barrier island, and it would shift according to changes in ice, in seeding that expanded the rice and oats that were there. Again, referring to this picture, you can see the area on the northwest corner is basically a little creek that was the northern entrance to the cove. That area expanded and contracted with various changes over the years. There were also times where rice and oats would establish themselves for a year or two on the western shore of South Cove. And this all provided a great habitat to the point that duck hunters would go out and plant wild rice to try and encourage ducks and geese in the fall to come by so they could, of course, shoot them. But so it was in good shape for quite a while, and including when we wrote the harbor plan in the late 1980s, it was over 20 acres. In the 80s, late 80s, and sometime in the 90s, it became a new habitat for an invasive species of Phragmite. Deep, then it was just Department of Environmental Protection, got a grant and decided to attack the Phragmite, which they did in the early 2000s. 3 years in a row, they mowed down the Phragmite and then sprayed it to try and kill it and take it away. And they were successful. When they began this, the Phragmite was 14 to 15 feet high. By the time they chopped it down and managed to kill it, it was only the grasses, which were just a few feet high on the island. So people in South Cove, and especially in the northern part of South Cove, had their view greatly improved. And it became reflected in their taxes that went up as well because of the increase in property value. So we now had dead Phragmite whose root structure was holding Thatchbed together. And there was no plan, unfortunately, as to what to do after they killed the Phragmite. There was also invasive species of a shrub called blue indigo on the southern end, and that part was left alone. What happens, the root structure for the Phragmite started to die away. So wave action and ice and what have you would get in there and eat at the basic structure of the island. And you can see it now as it has eroded, and you're getting pockets here and there that are trying to cling it together. Excuse me. If we also look back at the potentials, there's something in the river that is kind of unique, and I don't know where the origin is exactly, but there are stone piers. And at one point, in the 50s, 60s visuals, you can see two little stone piers poking out from the southern end of Thatchbed. Similar stone piers can be seen along the shore of Knot Island, the north side of Brockway Island, and in Lyme, just north of Knot Island, there are a couple of more. I've counted about 16 from the mouth of the river to Deep River that were created. Most people believe that these were created for fishing. You could put stakes in and create a weir. Most of these are in sets of two. So those were not maintained, and flotsam and trees and what have you being swept downriver when there were floods, and icebergs would be hitting the rocks and knock them into the water, which successfully changed them from rock piers to literally piles of rock that are now navigation hazard. In the late 1950s, mid to late 1950s, a gentleman from Hartford came in and had a proposal that he was going to dredge the southern part of South Cove, bulkhead Thatchbed Island, and turn it into an island with a restaurant, marina, office, and so forth. And so he was going to create a big marina out of it. The response was not favorable, to say the least. And a number of property owners then claimed to have ownership of parts of the island, some of which were questionable. How to solve this and not have a situation where somebody could come in and actually construct and rebuild the island ended up being the formation of Essex Land Trust. And even today, the Land Trust owns the majority of what's left of the island. We're down to a little less than 8 acres, and more than 6 of that belongs to the Land Trust. So we have a situation that the Army Corps changed the channel, which changed the way the water washed across the face of Thatchbed. And in this illustration, you can see an area just below the label of mooring field with the yellowish greenish. That shows where we're having shoaling come in the middle of the southern anchorage part. And you can also see the yellow part, which means there's very little water at low tide, and how the island has eroded away and it's filling in. It was certainly an unintended consequence of Corps changing the river channel, which changed the flow and has not allowed flushing and cleaning out along the face of Thatchbed. And of course, it was an unintended consequence of Deep trying to get rid of the Phragmite, which had also a major effect. So what we've seen is from 20 plus acres down to roughly 8 right now, and it's slipping away. We see the potential, unfortunately, of Thatchbed to completely disappear. It's in a couple of areas right now, it's very thin. This shows a recently disappeared section below what is now there. This was where the blue indigo shrub was, and that is very much affected when it ice over and the ice moves and icebergs downriver can tear out the shrubs because the root structures are not strong. So we're looking at what can we do to this? There are some restrictions as to what can be done. The Land Trust got involved with the Department of Agriculture for a conservation easement. The government is doing nothing to conserve or restore or anything like that on Thatchbed. As a matter of fact, they don't allow you to do anything to it. So there's no permission to do anything there. So what we've got is a potential plan that has been applied for, is starting with the rock piles that used to be piers. They're now a hazard to navigation and boats have hit them. They're marked as danger rock piles, and they're above water at low tide. We, in the past, got permission to remove them, but the policy at Deep at the time meant remove them completely, which would have given us 2 choices. Treat them as a dredge situation and dump them in a material deposit area and Long Island Sound, or, and we tried to do this working with Haynes. Haynes had agreed because stones at the quarry are their business, and they were going to take trucks and we'd load the stones onto trucks and haul them away. When it went out to bid to look at this, it became obvious it was way too expensive and we couldn't get anything accomplished on that standpoint. At that point, there was still a lot more to Thatchbed than there is now. So what we've come up with is a proposal that we would take the rock piles and relocate them, starting in an area where you saw the shrubs a little while back, and create sort of a berm, also known as a stone sill, in a line along the edge of what used to be the thatch bed. And part of the thinking behind this is, if we could do this, A, we would break up the wave action that is accelerating erosion and create a barrier to stop the waves from doing that. We would also be able to create an area that we might be able to place dredge material. So when it comes time to dredge, as we are looking at now with Essex Yacht Club is looking into it, Middle Cove Marine is looking into it, and so are others. This could be an area that we could put the dredge material there, which would build up and give us a restoration, if you will, of the area south and some of the curved areas that are being eroding away now. The second part of the proposal to consider would be taking trees, and we get a lot of trees that get washed down the river. I was out on the river this weekend, and we saw sections of trees that were bigger than telephone poles. They're a hazard to navigation in themselves, and you have to be careful where you go. So there's a thought that if we could capture some of those trees and pin them on the east side, just away from what is left of the island, that would also create a wave barrier and could join up with the relocated rock piles and further create an area that might be able to be used to put dredge material. There's a demand for other than Long Island Sound as a place to put dredge material. And it's been done successfully in some areas. Chester's an example where they have used it for fill landward. And it's meant that it's less expensive and easier, does not get complicated with arguments with state of New York as to what can be put where. Connecticut and New York have had to go to court over it. And while Connecticut wins, New York is still able to put up barriers and make life expensive and difficult for taking care of dredge that way. So one of the concerns, of course, is if this continues and we get a hurricane, the prevailing winds for rainstorms and hurricanes from the southeast. That means from Calves Island. And that's open water in a straight line to Thatchbed of about 2.5 to 3 miles. When you get a hurricane coming through, winds over 75 miles an hour, you can get large waves that could be washing against houses and against the area in Middle Cove would be pretty much disastrous for anybody in there. The second likely storm position is for a nor'easter. And from that, basically it's a straight shot of about 1.5 miles or so from Brockway Island to where Thatchbed was. And right now, you see this narrow tip at the end, good sized waves and storm winds and what have you can go straight into the residences in the southern part of South Cove. If we can do some restoration and help preserve what's left of this, we can prevent that from happening. the barrier consequence of the island protects houses in the South Cove and Middle Cove, and keeps them from having to face those heavy winds and waves. So the other part, unfortunately, pretty much the habitat is gone. There are some birds that are still occasionally nesting there. We get osprey nesting in a spot on the island where it used to be more than one couple. The island used to be home to the swallows that we see, and used to have red-winged blackbirds, geese, ducks, snapping turtles use it as a, or used to use it as an area to lay their eggs. Actually, it also used to be a trapper's home. Muskrat was thorough throughout the island. And in the 50s and 60s, people would go out and set traps and snare the muskrat. Unfortunately, that's going away. I used to see deer go out there and feed occasionally. Haven't seen that in ages because what they were feeding on basically has gone away. So we're in a predicament. We're hoping that we can make some action, because I think it would be a really sad thing to see it continue to erode away and then have people say, why didn't somebody do something when they could have? So that's pretty much my summary on the history and the condition of Thatchbed. One of the things that we have on our website, or the harbor management website, is something called a harbor report that shows historical pictures and topographical survey, hydrographical survey, excuse me, as well as current vector analysis on the east side that shows the various tide levels and what the current is like as it passes by. All of this really gives us a good background into what we are dealing with. One of the concerns, of course, is on that picture we showed earlier, where it's starting to fill in into the southern Anchorage area. If it fills in too far, we have to take away some of the moorings that are out there, because there won't be deep enough water for all of the boats. And as that yellow part moves eastward, we've already had to see some of the moorings move eastward as well, because at low tide, the edge of the yellow is not enough water to operate an outboard even. So it goes from where it used to be more than sufficient water for sailboats with keels. We now have to take a closer look at that and maybe move things around. If it continues, consideration would be needed for dredging. And if we can create this rim around the island, that would give us some place to put the material, and we can maybe improve and get back a little more of what we've lost. If not, the dredging becomes extremely expensive, possibly to the point of being prohibitive. And then we lose the moorings in that area. So the tree concept we already have on the Middle Cove side of Thatchbed. Right now, there are 3 large tree sections that have lodged themselves there. And on the eastern side, there are some spots where tree sections have taken up residence. There's nothing holding them in position at this point. And we can't do anything until DEEP gives us permission. And we do have an application before them to test this out and see what they will let us do. That's about where we are with this. So,
All right. Jeff, thanks. We've got one question so far, and I think you've done a good job basically answering this question, but maybe a one final summary would be beneficial. And it was a question of why save Thatchbed? What makes Thatchbed important for Essex?
well, the first part is it's a barrier island. It protects a lot of the harbor front and the village area of Essex. If it weren't there, when a storm comes along, you can see serious damage to property. You would see at a typical hurricane as it comes through, if you take high tide where it is now, it's roughly 4 feet above low tide. And there are a number of spots in Middle Cove in particular, and at other places around where the lawn, the bulkheads that protect the lawns and the land that's there are only 1 or 2 feet above the high tide mark. When a hurricane comes through, on average, with the flooding that it comes with it, it's about 6 feet above the high tide mark. And then you add to that crashing waves and so forth. There are houses and foundations of buildings in Middle Cove that at that kind of a level would have waves crashing against the housing. That would create possible further erosion. And that is what the barrier island gives a protection to. The habitat part of this I mentioned has largely gone away, but there are still osprey there. There are swan that visit. We do get geese and ducks for periods of time. And of course, cormorants are all around us, not that we want to encourage them because they make a mess. But that's the biggest thing. This once nice natural habitat is gone basically, and the animals with it naturally. The property protection and value is, I think it's important. It would make a mess in there.
Right. Kind of piggybacking on that last question, another participant has asked if Thatchbed disappears, do I understand that South Cove will fill in faster than it already is doing?
I can't quite answer that very well. When we created the harbor plan, now we're talking about 88, 89, we were looking at the coves and the situation with the coves. At that point, there was a little bit of a channel in the northern part of South Cove. There had been a marked by local residents channel in the south end. Back in the 50s and 60s, there were people in Mallard Point that had several decent sized boats, including a keel centerboard arrangement on a 30-something foot sailboat that followed the channel in, and they had it parked in front of their house. There was a channel on the northern part, as I say, that was probably a foot or so deep at low tide, but it was, not very much there. But you could get boats in and out. So when we did this in the late 80s, we still had a little bit of channels there. And we went to the state environmental people and inquired about things. And I forget his name, but the head of, at the state level at that time, said that South Cove was going through the natural process of eutrophication, which is the fancy word for saying it was filling in and that you were going to see swamp-like grasses and stuff emerge in South Cove. Hasn't really happened that way. In the areas where people have boats and use them, the natural thing that happens is boats, as they move through the water, stir up the ground, if you will, the mud. And that stirring up, when you've got ebb and flow of tides, can help keep a channelway open. Not necessarily very deeply, but can help that happen. The filling in from the erosion of Thatchbed, we are seeing primarily east of the island, not west of the island. Including the erosion on the northwest corner, which is claimed by the state of Connecticut as part of their holdings. If you take a look at that now, it's just much of their quote holding is a mud flat, and the acreage that they had is less than half of what they had even as little as 20 years ago. Where does it go? Some of it erodes and flows into Middle Cove because the channel in Middle Cove gets dredged occasionally. I think it was 11 or 12, 2011 or 2012, the last time they did that. And they typically dredge it to an 8-foot channel. So it would be natural that wave action and erosion and what have you would fill there because there is not a strong current moving through there. A little bit of one with the ebb and flow, but nothing really strong to, to wash it away.
There's an offer from one of our participants relative to creating a barrier. This individual says that they live in South Cove and they get many large 25-foot or more in length logs and trees every spring, and he wants to know if you want them.
Possibly. If we get permission, yeah, but we have to be careful about this because it takes certain equipment to be able to do this. We can't just tow a log, particularly in the time when boats are on moorings, because that becomes another issue. Also, some of the work, like if we get the permission to move the rocks, and I would say it looks pretty good at that. Our proposal is being presented by the town. This is not a harbor management proposal. And we've reviewed this with Deep in Hartford, and they've previewed, and they're the ones that gave us permission that we didn't come up with the money to do it a few years ago. Their policy for a long time has been not to allow things like the rock. It's, they call some of that riprap, and that's, as far as Deep is concerned, is a dirty word, and riprap can't be used. On the other hand, riprap was used extensively on the North Meadows. Pettapauga Yacht Club, Essex Boat Club has a bulkhead and riprap. Private property owners, excuse me, pushed rocks and what they could to the edge of the river when they were allowed to. And that's what's allowed the meadows up there to stay intact. If not for that, if Pettapauga did not impose the rocks on the riverside, it certainly would have been washed away by now. So even though it was a bad thing, it could have been helpful if it were used more. Understanding that the development of Essex Boat Club and Pettapauga came about in the 1950s, the early 50s actually. Pettapog was 51. Zoning didn't come into play until 1966. Deep didn't come into play until 1980. So there were a lot of things that happened back when you could, quote, just go out and do things. And a lot of people went out and did things that weren't beneficial. And there was a lot of bulkheading and stuff like that that happened in places that were negative on the environment and didn't help things except improve their property situation. So when we went to them with this concept that the rock piers, we've got pictures of them when they were piers. They're well known from aerial photographs, they can be seen. So it's taking what has deteriorated and now become a hazard and simply moving it in a place where it would not be a hazard and could be a benefit if we can work with a dredge material. So far, Deep seemed to be approving of the concept of moving the rocks and putting the trees in place. They have not been presented, although they know that we would like to eventually be able to put dredge material there. They would like to find places where dredging material can be placed that would not involve the battles with New York over placing them in Long Island Sound, excuse me. Understand that there is a environmentally approved theoretical deposit spot off New London. This is the one New York fights about right now. If you can't go to New London, the next closest place is New Haven, off New Haven, or down off Norwalk. It means taking a loaded barge, running down the river with it, then the close one would be New London. New Haven's going to be 25 miles or so down the Sound. Norwalk, as you can imagine, is a lot further. It's time, tug and barge. It's the time they have to figure out the tides, so they try to get the tides with them, and it just starts raising the costs for dredging dramatically.
Jeff, in addition to some of the barriers and the dredging that you talked about, there's a question about what more could be done about the boat wakes and their impact on Thatchbed in terms of the erosion. Are there additional measures that could be taken?
The zone between the day marker 25 and the Nun 28 at the north end of the harbor is an official no wake zone. Unfortunately, when Deep chose to mark the zone, they placed the western marker for the zone about 20 or 25 yards north of the day marker, the lighthouse that's down there. And they placed the eastern one further north. So people can be coming upriver, particularly when there's a tide with them. They can be coming upriver throwing a big boat wake. And they can continue past the, quote, beginning of the no wake zone. And that wake will carry, and it diminishes, but when you've got the tide with you, it diminishes less. And part of that hits Thatchbed area. Similarly, when coming downriver, the position of the markers is better, but when there's an outgoing current, which actually on the surface is more than 50% of the time because of fresh water coming downriver, and salt water is heavier than fresh water. So when the tide comes in, it's salt water coming underneath. So boats carrying big weight downriver, that weight carries, it doesn't make it to Thatchbed so much, but it definitely affects Essex Island Marina, down even to the a museum. And there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Officially, there are speed limits in the river. You might be amazed to know that. At certain times, like Sundays and what have you, it's 35 miles an hour. Maximum speed is supposed to be 45 miles an hour. It's unenforceable. Excuse me. The state police, as an example, have a hard enough time giving you a ticket for speeding when you can challenge on the validity of the radar gun. When was it last certified? The certification of the radar gun operator. He had to have been standing still in you know, that kind of a situation. When you get to the water, and they tried this when they first did this years ago, they can't give you a ticket for speeding because they can't determine how fast the boat was going at the time. Not the whole picture, because the boat's going to say, well, there was 2 knots of current beneath me. I also had a tailwind and so forth. And they can argue that way. And basically, they've given up on the concept of trying to keep people from speeding. The Essex Harbor Patrol is the most visible and active harbor patrol that I know on the river. They go out there. They can't do much. I mean, they can pull you over. They can check the validity of your registration. They can do all of that. For the most part, they don't bother because it's too much of a pain. But just their presence, throwing the siren on, flashing the lights and that sort of thing, people do slow down for them. You go by Saybrook. I went through Saybrook this weekend. Saybrook had a police boat out and was doing nothing about boats making big wake going through their no wake zone. Jet skis flying along at 45, 50 miles an hour. There was nobody out there policing that. Whereas the Essex Harbor Patrol does do it, and they're very careful about it. Old Lyme doesn't have anything. Lyme looks for Essex for all its assistance, basically. Deep River doesn't have a Marine Patrol out doing anything. So people understand when they get to Essex, they have to slow down, and they do get hit on their wakes, but they, the rest of it is wide open. A lot of the wave action is simply from weather. Especially when we get these heavy rainstorms and what have you. The wind comes up and you get waves. They don't have to be big ones. Big ones may be more effective, but even the little ones. I was sitting on my boat on my mooring 2 or 3 weeks ago, and in the summertime, the thermal, the sun heats up things. The heat on the land rises. And in the afternoon, typically, the water is cooler. The air moves off the water to the land. So it creates a typical southwest afternoon breeze. We see this in Essex all the time. Right now, that southwest breeze comes up from the southwest corner of South Cove and hits that area just south of what is left of Thatchbed. And on that particular day, it was a brisk breeze. It was probably 15 knots or so. And you could see it form waves, and you could see the waves wash across that area, stir up the mud, carry the mud to that area that we showed you in the yellow on the east side. Then the waves settle down. And the sediment is just settling right down as well.
So A final question that's come in from chat, and it may be an opportunity, Jeff, to just kind of summarize maybe perhaps next steps. But the question reads in part, how far is the Harbor Commission from adopting and implementing a plan to save Thatchbed? What does it take to implement a plan? How long would it take? What are the estimate of costs? So it sounds like you've already addressed a number of things that are under consideration. Part of this, I guess, would be next steps.
The harbor management plan has chosen not to take any actions with regard to Thatchbed. They've determined, the commission has determined that they want no involvement with it. In the meanwhile, the town, Norm and the selectmen would like to see something done for the protection of the town. So the application that I mentioned has been put together not as a harbor management item, but as the town. The Harbor Management Commission would be interested in seeing the rock piles diverted or removed because there are a number of boats that have gotten serious damage to them, and the current way they are, it's a hazard to navigation. If they were removed, it might provide a better area for some moorings, maybe add 2 or 3 better mooring areas down there. So from the Harbor Management Commission, dealing with the rocks is something that they're willing to support, but they're not willing to directly get involved in anything with Thatchbed at this point. That's not my opinion, that's the commission's stated opinion.
Okay. Jeff, we got a couple of minutes left before we have to adjourn.
Let me just make a
sure.
let me just make a little addition to that.
Sure.
I forgot to mention, there's grant money available to do a lot of things. And that money renews depending upon specific grant. It renews pretty much every year. Long Island Sound Futures is one organization funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Fund, is a major source for that. National Fish and Wildlife Fund has full-time employees who are monitoring situations all across the country. The source for funding from them is federal, and it's based on taxes that you pay with sporting goods and that sort of thing. Long Island Sound Futures Fund gets some money from that, and we have applied for a grant to do the steps that I outlined: move the rocks, set the trees up. We can get the rocks done fairly inexpensively because at high tide, a crane on a barge can get in there at high tide, pick rocks up on one side and put them to the other side. So that can be done relatively inexpensively. I should also add that there is something else that's happened that affects our harbor, although we don't know exactly what the effect is at this point. The NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric, etc., is a federal agency that has a project called the National Estuarine Research Reserve, nicknamed NERR, N-E-R-R. A couple years ago, Connecticut was one of 2 saltwater states that did not take part in this program. The program is largely funded with federal money. I think it's in the neighborhood of 70% of operating costs. And what happens is each state has a unique area that is designated as part of the estuary research. And they perform research on water level, water quality, salt water, habitat, all of that sort of stuff, the fish and wildlife things. And they end up with a manager and an administrative person. Yukon Avery Point is involved in Connecticut's proposal with DEEP as being the primary. So they came up with a plan, and each state's plan area has to be different with a different, so you're accumulating different types of data and research instead of being redundant. They submitted in December of 2019 the proposal for Connecticut, and it has been approved by NOAA and DEEP, University of Connecticut, et cetera, are currently coming up with a plan of action and what have you. In Connecticut, the area is divided into two sections that they're going to have this research reserve. The first area is in the Connecticut River, and it starts from the northern edge of the Lord Creek Wildlife Management Area, which is already a piece of conservation land, and extends westward across the Connecticut River, meaning that it lands about halfway down the meadows north of Essex Island. The western border follows the border of Essex Island, the village, the eastern edge of Thatchbed, down the river, and includes a lot of other areas that are already conservation and conservancy areas. When you're in near, there then becomes federal money available with variations on how it can be used and what have you, but they can acquire their ownership and take over their actions for conservation and for preventing erosion and improving habitat. Again, details have not been finalized on the Connecticut one, but Essex Harbor and Thatchbed being at the edge of the near have potential that might become involved with near and for expanding the opportunity for improving the situation, both as a habitat and barrier island.
That's great. And that's what I was going to actually kind of go to next, Jeff, and you anticipated it for me. What I'll do is I'll make sure that I work with you to get a link to that near related site on the DEEP webpage, so that that'll become part of our resource sheet, and folks can track the further development of this. But that sounds very promising. I don't see any other questions coming in through chat, but this has been, we've had great questions, and this has been great discussion. Jeff, first, I wanted to express my thanks to you again for your wonderful presentation, and actually to the entire Harbor Management Commission for all the work that you do for us. Your personal attention and your personal expertise is a really, really valuable resource to this town. So I appreciate you making the time today to be part of this. I also want to thank all of you who've registered and participated this afternoon. This is important information, and you know, it's great to see so many people engaged. As I mentioned at the outset, a resource sheet will be sent to all of you, in fact, to everyone who's registered and perhaps may not have had a chance to log in this afternoon. That'll get out. I'll get that out the door within about the next day or so. That will include a link to this presentation. It'll include links to some other resources, including the Harbor Management Report, and especially to that National Estuary Research Reserve that Jeff was just talking about. So we'll get that out the door right away, and keep a lookout in your inboxes for all that. And then one final thing I wanted to just remind folks is that our next seed event is going to take place on Thursday, July 29th. And it's going to be a different kind of event for us. It's going to feature Chester artist Kate Hare, and she's going to do a presentation on how the Connecticut River Valley really provides an inspiration for her artwork. And it's really beautiful. I've been working with Kate on this, and I think it's going to be a wonderful presentation. So again, keep on the lookout for your inboxes. We'll get a special email out on that. Also our website and our Facebook pages. So again, that resource sheet will be coming to you shortly. Ways to contact Sustainable Essex will be there as in addition to that additional information. So once again, folks, thanks so much for joining us. Jeff, thank you very much for all the work you're doing and for this great presentation. And I don't see any other questions in chat, so I will bid everyone a good afternoon, and stay cool and stay safe. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.